Hey everyone, tonight we're uncovering the greatest religious conspiracy in human history. Not a secret plot, but a spiritual war that raged for over 3 centuries and completely rewrote the fate of the Western world. Before we begin, hit like if you're ready to discover how one empire's conversion didn't just change politics, but erased entire civilizations of gods. And let me know in the comments if you've ever noticed pagan symbols hiding in plain sight in Christian traditions. Now dim those lights and settle in. We're about to explore how the Roman Empire, home to 10,000 gods and the greatest religious marketplace in history, became the weapon that Christianity used to systematically hunt down and destroy every other faith on earth, leaving behind a spiritual wasteland that we're still living in today. Now, without further ado, let's begin. In the marble halls of Rome, 10,000 gods watch from their niches. The year is 250 AD, and the empire stretches from the mist-shrouded forests of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Syria. But this is not merely a political dominion. It is a cosmos made flesh, a sacred geography where every crossroads holds an altar and every household harbors its own divine guardians. Walk through any Roman city at dawn, and you will hear the empire's true heartbeat, the murmur of 10 million prayers rising like smoke from 10 million shrines. This is the last great pagan empire, and it pulses with a spiritual energy that will soon be snuffed out forever. Stand in the Forum Romanum as the sun crests the 7 hills. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, looms above you, its bronze doors gleaming like shields of the gods themselves. Here, in the beating heart of the empire, the old contract between heaven and earth still holds firm. The priests emerge in their white togas, their hands steady as they lift the sacred knives. The bull's blood will flow red across ancient stones, and the gods will answer with victory, with harvest, with the continuation of the world itself. But Jupiter does not rule alone. In this cosmic empire, the divine hierarchy mirrors the earthly one, vast, complex, and always hungry for worship. Mars stalks through the Campus Martius, his bronze eyes fixed on distant battlefields where Roman eagles carry his blessing into barbarian lands. Vesta tends her eternal flame in the circular temple that has never known darkness, her virgin priestesses guarding the very soul of Rome with their bodies and their lives. These are the state gods, the great powers who hold the empire together like pillars supporting the sky. But walk beyond the marble grandeur of the Forum, and you discover that Rome's true religious genius lies not in its gods, but in its appetite for them. In the Suburra, Rome's crowded working district, the air hangs thick with incense from a dozen different worlds. Here stands a shrine to Isis, the Black Madonna from the Nile, her bronze face gleaming with offerings of gold and desperate prayers. Beside it, carved into a basement wall, the sacred bull of Mithras bleeds eternally in stone, his blood promising rebirth to the soldiers who crawl through darkness to receive it. This is the empire's great secret. Rome does not conquer gods, it collects them. When Roman legions march into Gaul, they do not merely subjugate the Celtic tribes. They adopt their forest spirits, their sacred springs, their horned gods who rule the wilderness beyond civilization's edge. When Roman merchants establish trading posts in Egypt, they do not simply extract wealth. They extract wisdom, mystery, the promise of life beyond death that flows from temples older than Rome itself. The result is a religious ecosystem unlike anything the world has ever seen. Venus becomes Aphrodite, becomes Astarte, becomes Isis, each goddess maintaining her distinct personality while sharing in a cosmic dance of desire and creation. Mercury guides souls and messages, whether he wears Roman sandals or Egyptian wings, or Germanic furs. The gods multiply, merge, and multiply again, creating a divine harmony that seems capable of encompassing all possible forms of human longing. Walk through any major Roman city, Alexandria, Antioch, Lugdunum, and you witness this theological symphony in full crescendo. Syrian priests chant to Baal in the morning. Greek philosophers debate the nature of the divine in the afternoon. Roman matrons pour wine for their household gods at evening, and Persian merchants burn sacred fires to Ahura Mazda through the night. All of this unfolds beneath the benevolent gaze of the emperor's image, the living God who unites all other gods in his divine person. But this is no mere spiritual marketplace. The gods of Rome command wealth that rivals the imperial treasury itself. In Ephesus, the temple of Artemis employs thousands, priests and priestesses, scribes and accountants, goldsmiths and silk merchants, prostitutes and philosophers. The goddess's silver cult statues require their own workshops, their own trade routes, their own banking systems. When the faithful arrive for the great festival, they bring not just their prayers but their purses, transforming religious devotion into economic engine that drives the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The pattern repeats across the empire. The oracle at Delphi generates more revenue than most provincial cities. The mysteries of Eleusis draw pilgrims whose journey expenses support entire regions of Greece. Even small-town temples function as banks, lending money at interest and investing in everything from shipping ventures to slave markets. The priests grow fat on this divine prosperity. They wear purple-striped togas that rival senatorial dress. They own vast estates worked by temple slaves. They marry their daughters to senators and their sons to merchant princes. The gods, it seems, reward their servants well in this world as well as the next. Yet the true power of Roman religion lies not in its grand temples or golden treasures, but in its infiltration of the most ordinary moments of human existence. In every Roman home, no matter how humble, the lares and penates maintain their eternal vigil. These household gods, the lares who guard the crossroads and boundaries, the penates who protect the family's food stores, transform every meal into a sacrament, every threshold into a sacred space. The paterfamilias pours wine for them each morning, and they respond by keeping his children healthy, his business profitable, his enemies at bay. Watch a Roman woman preparing dinner, and you witness theology in action. She sprinkles salt on the hearth for Vesta, murmurs a prayer to the penates as she opens the grain jar, leaves a crust of bread outside for the lares before serving her family. Her entire day unfolds within a web of divine relationships, each gesture both practical and sacred, each moment pregnant with the possibility of blessing or curse. The calendar itself breathes with divine rhythm. Every month brings its festivals, its holy days, its moments when the boundary between mortal and immortal grows thin. The Lupercalia in February, when young men run naked through the streets, striking women with goatskin thongs to ensure fertility. The Floralia in May, when prostitutes dance in the streets and flowers rain from every window. The Saturnalia in December, when slaves become masters and masters become slaves, and the world turns upside down in joyous celebration of chaos. Roman religion is not merely emotion and tradition, it is a sophisticated technology for reading the will of heaven. The augurs stand on the Palatine Hill each morning, their trained eyes scanning the flight patterns of birds, translating the language of wings and wind into divine counsel for emperors and merchants alike. No major military campaign begins without consulting the auspices. No important marriage contract is signed without examining the entrails of sacrificed animals. No new building is erected without determining the proper ritual orientation to attract beneficial divine energies. This is not superstition. This is science, as rigorous and systematic as engineering or medicine. The priests study for decades to master the complex rules governing divine communication. They memorize vast catalogues of omens, learn to read the subtle variations in flame color that indicate divine approval or disapproval, practice the precise hand movements required to please each different god. The haruspices, specialists in reading animal entrails, train their eyes to detect the slightest abnormalities in liver texture or heart configuration. A single misplaced blood vessel can alter the fate of armies. A slightly discolored lung can postpone a triumph. The gods speak constantly, but only to those who know how to listen. By the middle of the 3rd century AD, this vast religious organism has reached a kind of perfect equilibrium. The old gods of Rome maintain their ancient honors while embracing new manifestations and new peoples. Mystery religions offer individual salvation to those seeking personal relationship with the divine. Local deities continue their ancient protections of hearth and field and forest. The imperial cult provides political unity wrapped in theological language. Each level of society finds its spiritual home. Senators sacrifice to Jupiter and debate Stoic philosophy. Soldiers swear oaths to Mithras in underground chambers. Merchants pray to Mercury for profitable voyages. Slaves find comfort in Isis, who promises that the last shall be first in the world to come. Women seek the protection of Juno Lucina in childbirth and Diana in the hunt. The system works because it makes room for everyone and everything. Roman pragmatism has created a religious marketplace where spiritual supply meets spiritual demand with beautiful efficiency. There is a god for every need, a ritual for every crisis, a festival for every season of the human heart. The physical landscape of the empire reflects this divine abundance. Every crossroads holds its shrine to the Lares. Every household maintains its lararium, a small altar where the family gods receive their daily offerings. Every neighborhood has its temples to the popular deities: Mercury for the merchants, Minerva for the craftsmen, Venus for the lovers. The great cities rise like sacred mountains, their skylines bristling with temple roofs and divine statues. Rome itself becomes a vast outdoor museum of the world's gods, each conquered people adding their deities to the ever-expanding pantheon. The Campus Martius alone contains temples to gods from Gaul, Germany, Syria, Egypt, and Persia. Their different architectural styles creating a symphony in stone of humanity's diverse approaches to the divine. In the countryside, ancient sacred groves maintain their primordial mystery. Here, Celtic druids still perform their secret rituals, now simply reimagined as exotic variations of Roman religious practice. Germanic tribes honor their forest gods alongside Roman deities, finding in Mercury Woden or Mars Tyr the same divine energies their ancestors worshipped under different names. Yet beneath this glorious diversity, a fatal flaw lurks in the empire's spiritual foundation. Roman religion, for all its magnificence, rests on a simple principle: accommodation. The gods can be bargained with, negotiated with, managed through proper ritual and adequate sacrifice. They are powerful, but not absolute, demanding but reasonable, jealous, but ultimately practical. They want worship, sacrifice, and respect, but they do not demand the complete transformation of human nature. This flexibility, which has made Rome's religious system so successful, will prove its greatest weakness when confronted by a faith that offers no compromise, recognizes no middle ground, and demands nothing less than the complete surrender of the human soul. The gods of Rome have grown comfortable in their marble temples, fat on their sacrifices, content with their ancient honors. They do not know that in the shadows of their own empire, a new god is stirring, one who will offer not accommodation, but ultimatum, not addition, but replacement, not tolerance, but truth. The year is 250 AD, and the last great pagan empire stands at the height of its spiritual power. In temples from York to Alexandria, priests perform their ancient rituals with confidence born of 8 centuries of success. The gods seem secure in their marble homes, eternal as the empire itself. They do not know they have less than a century left to live. The incense still rises from 10,000 altars. But somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the hymns and sacrificial chants, another sound grows stronger with each passing year. The soft, relentless whisper of prayer to a god who promises not to join the pantheon, but to destroy it. The wheel of heaven is beginning to turn, and when it stops, the world will never be the same again. In the narrow streets of Rome's Subura, where the scent of urine mingles with burning incense, strange whispers travel from mouth to mouth in the darkness. They speak of a God who died. Not metaphorically, not in the cyclical death and rebirth that marks the mystery religions, but actually historically, bloodily died. Nailed to wood like a common criminal, abandoned by his followers, mocked by soldiers as he gasped his last breath. This God did not die beautifully in a sacred grove or tragically in a divine war. He died ugly, publicly, humiliatingly in the dust outside Jerusalem while his mother wept. The very idea should have died with him. In the Roman world, where gods are powerful and eternal, where divinity means mastery over fate and death, the notion of a crucified deity borders on blasphemy. Yet somehow, impossibly, the whispers grow stronger with each passing year. They call themselves Christians, these followers of the dead God, and they spread through the empire's shadows like a fever. In basement rooms and abandoned warehouses, in the catacombs beneath the city, where the dead sleep in endless rows, they gather to perform their strange rituals. They eat their god's flesh and drink his blood, or so the rumors claim. They call each other brother and sister, while engaging in activities that would make a Bacchanalian blush. They refuse to honor the emperor, refuse to sacrifice to the gods, refuse to participate in the very fabric of Roman religious life. The empire has dealt with dangerous foreign cults before. In 186 BC, the Senate moved decisively against the Bacchanalian conspiracy, crushing what they saw as a threat to Roman moral order. The Bacchanalia had grown too wild, too secretive, too disconnected from state oversight. Senators spoke of midnight orgies, ritual murders, conspiracies against the government itself. Whether the accusations were true or merely political paranoia hardly mattered. The cult was eliminated with the brutal efficiency that had built the empire. But Christianity proves different, more persistent, more dangerous. Where the Bacchanalia offered ecstasy and liberation from conventional morality, Christianity demands moral purity that exceeds even Roman standards. Where mystery religions promised individual salvation through secret knowledge, Christianity proclaims universal salvation through public confession. Where traditional gods required ritual sacrifice and proper forms, this Christ demands the sacrifice of the entire self, mind, body, soul, and social standing. Most troubling of all, Christians refuse the basic courtesy that holds the empire together. They will not add their God to the pantheon. They will not find room for Jupiter alongside their Christ, will not honor Mars while also honoring their Prince of Peace. Their God is not a God among gods, but the only God, the true God, the God beside whom all other deities are demons masquerading as light. This exclusivity marks them as atheists in Roman eyes, atheoi, godless ones who deny the very existence of the divine powers that maintain cosmic order. An atheist is not merely someone who follows different gods. An atheist is someone who threatens the fundamental structure of reality itself. The first systematic persecution comes under Emperor Decius in 249 AD. Decius, a traditionalist who sees the empire's recent troubles as divine punishment for neglecting the old gods, issues an unprecedented order. Every citizen must sacrifice to the gods and obtain a certificate proving their loyalty. The libelli, these small papyrus documents, become the empire's first mass surveillance system, a religious ID card that separates the faithful from the dangerous. For most Romans, the requirement poses no hardship. They burn their pinch of incense, mumble a prayer to the emperor's genius, collect their certificate, and return to their daily lives. The gods receive their due, the emperor receives his recognition, and the cosmic order remains intact. But Christians face an impossible choice. They can sacrifice and deny their God, saving their lives but damning their souls. They can flee to the countryside and hope the authorities lose interest. Or they can refuse, accept arrest, and face whatever horrors await those who defy the emperor's will. Thousands choose defiance. The amphitheaters of the empire, those grand stages where Romans celebrate their dominance over nature and chaos, become theaters of religious drama, unlike anything the world has seen. Christians are brought before the crowds, not merely to die, but to recant, to acknowledge the gods and save their lives. The executions become recruitment events. Each martyrdom, a public sermon preached in blood. Watch Perpetua die in Carthage, a young mother whose faith burns brighter than the torches that light the arena. She refuses to sacrifice for her infant son's sake, refuses to acknowledge any god but Christ, refuses even the simple gesture that would save her life. The crowd jeers as the beasts tear her flesh, but something in her unwavering certainty plants seeds of doubt in minds that witness her impossible courage. Watch Polycarp burn in Smyrna, the old bishop who has served his God for 86 years and will not deny him now. The flames dance around his body, but seem reluctant to consume him, as if fire itself hesitates to destroy such conviction. When he finally dies, witnesses swear they smell not burning flesh, but sweet incense rising from his pyre. The executions should end the threat. Public death has always been Rome's final argument against disorder, the ultimate demonstration that the emperor's power exceeds any human will to resist. But Christian martyrdom transforms defeat into victory, death into advertisement, persecution into proof of divine favor. Each martyr becomes a hero to the underground communities that remember their names, cherish their final words, venerate their bones. The catacombs fill not only with bodies but with stories, legends, promises that death is not the end, but the beginning of eternal triumph. Where traditional Roman religion offers divine favor in exchange for proper ritual, Christianity offers divine favor specifically because of suffering, specifically because of rejection by the world. The religion spreads through existing Roman networks with viral efficiency. Paul of Tarsus, that strange Jew who carries Roman citizenship like a passport to the empire's heart, exploits every road, every trade route, every administrative connection that links the Mediterranean world together. Roman infrastructure, designed to move legions and tax collectors, becomes the nervous system of Christian expansion. The new faith finds its strongest roots in the empire's cities, among populations already uprooted from traditional tribal and family religious structures. Slaves who have been torn from their ancestral gods find comfort in a god who was himself tortured by imperial power. Merchants who travel far from their household, Lares discover in Christ a deity who transcends geographical boundaries. Women who chafe against the limited roles traditional religion offers them encounter in Christian communities a spiritual equality that revolutionary. But Christianity's appeal goes deeper than social convenience. In a world where most gods require elaborate ritual knowledge, expensive sacrifices, or initiation into costly mysteries, Christianity offers salvation to anyone willing to believe. No special education required, no aristocratic bloodline necessary, no complex theological training demanded, simply faith, pure, simple, revolutionary faith in a God who loves the poor more than the rich, the weak more than the strong, the outcast more than the insider. This theological populism terrifies Roman authorities, who understand that religion and politics intertwine like lovers in the dark. If Christ's kingdom is not of this world, as his followers claim, then what need do Christians have for Caesar's kingdom? If their true citizenship lies in heaven, then what loyalty do they owe to Rome? If their God's law supersedes human law, then what happens to the legal structure that holds the empire together? Under Emperor Valerian in 257 AD, persecution intensifies and systematizes. Christian clergy become specific targets, bishops arrested, deacons executed, church property confiscated. The empire recognizes that this is no longer about individual conscience, but about institutional competition. Christianity has developed its own hierarchy, its own financial networks, its own systems of authority that parallel and potentially threaten imperial administration. The Christian response reveals how far their organization has progressed. When Bishop Cyprian is arrested in Carthage, his trial becomes a public relations victory. He speaks with the calm authority of a man who represents not merely personal faith, but institutional power. His execution transforms him into a martyr, but more importantly, it demonstrates that Christianity has produced leaders capable of facing down imperial magistrates with dignity and sophistication. Deep in the Roman catacombs, Christian art begins to appear on tomb walls. Simple symbols at first, fish and anchors and shepherds, but gradually evolving into complex theological statements. Christ appears not as the suffering criminal of Calvary, but as the good shepherd, the divine teacher, the cosmic king. These images tell a story of transformation, of a faith growing more confident, more visually articulate, more capable of competing with traditional Roman religious iconography. The underground churches develop their own economic systems. Wealthy converts donate estates and gold to support poor believers. Christian merchants prioritize trade with fellow believers, creating commercial networks that span the empire. Bishops begin to function not merely as spiritual leaders, but as community organizers, welfare administrators, political advocates for their flocks. Most significantly, Christianity begins to produce its own intellectuals, thinkers capable of engaging Greek philosophy and Roman law on equal terms. Justin Martyr argues that Christianity represents the fulfillment of classical wisdom rather than its rejection. Origen develops systematic theology that rivals anything produced in the empire's academies. Julian writes legal briefs defending Christian rights with the same skill he once used prosecuting criminals in Roman courts. By the time Diocletian launches the Great Persecution in 303 AD, Christianity has become something unprecedented in Roman history, a counter-empire with its own laws, its own institutions, its own vision of human flourishing. The emperor's final attempt to crush the movement reveals not weakness, but strength. Churches burn, but Christians rebuild them. Scriptures are confiscated, but believers copy them from memory. Leaders are executed, but new leaders emerge from the ranks. The great irony becomes clear. Persecution has transformed Christianity from a Jewish sect into something far more dangerous, a universal religion capable of challenging Rome's monopoly on universal loyalty. Every martyr proves that Rome's power has limits. Every burned church demonstrates that there are treasures beyond imperial reach. Every confessor who survives torture shows that Caesar's will is not absolute. In the shadows beneath the empire, while priests still sacrifice bulls to Jupiter and philosophers still debate the nature of the divine, a new world is being born. It speaks a different language, worships a different God, dreams different dreams of human destiny. It promises not accommodation but transformation, not addition but replacement, not tolerance but truth. The empire that once absorbed gods now faces a God who refuses to be absorbed. The political machinery that once co-opted foreign deities now encounters a deity who demands the complete restructuring of political reality itself. The religious system that once grew stronger through diversity now confronts a faith that grows stronger through opposition. In basement rooms where Christians gather to break bread and share wine, they whisper prayers for their persecutors and plan for the day when their hidden God will reveal himself to the world. They do not yet know that day is coming sooner than anyone imagines. They do not yet know that one of Caesar's own successors will soon look up at their symbol in the sky and decide that if you cannot defeat the Christians, you must join them. The cross still hangs in the shadows, but the shadows are growing shorter with each passing year. The dawnlight cuts through October mist as Constantine's army approaches the Milvian Bridge. On the far side of the Tiber, Maxentius waits with superior numbers, superior position, and the blessing of Rome's ancient gods. The augurs have consulted the entrails. The auspices have spoken favorably. Jupiter himself seems to smile upon the defender of the eternal city. Constantine should retreat. Any rational general would retreat. But Constantine has seen something in the sky that has shattered every assumption about divine favor and imperial destiny. It begins as a dream, or perhaps a vision. The boundaries blur when gods speak to mortals. In the fevered sleep before battle, Constantine encounters a presence that identifies itself as the Christ, the God of the persecuted, the deity his predecessors have spent decades trying to exterminate. This God does not demand sacrifice or ritual purity. He offers a bargain as simple as it is revolutionary: victory in exchange for acknowledgement. "In this sign conquer," the voice whispers, and Constantine wakes to find his mind blazing with the image of a cross superimposed upon the sun. The emperor's craftsmen work frantically through the pre-dawn hours, painting the Chi-Rho symbol, the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek, upon shields and standards. His soldiers murmur uneasily as they prepare for battle under the banner of a crucified criminal. Some remember the Christians they have watched die in amphitheaters, the stubborn fanatics who chose torture over submission. Now their emperor asks them to fight under the same symbol that those fanatics died defending. But Constantine's certainty burns with the intensity of absolute conviction. He has spent his entire life calculating odds, weighing alliances, measuring the balance of divine favor. Now, calculation gives way to faith. And a faith promises what calculation never could. Not merely victory, but transformation. Not merely conquest, but rebirth. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge unfolds like a scene from religious mythology. Maxentius, confident in his defensive position, makes the fatal decision to cross the river and meet Constantine's charge head-on. His engineers construct a temporary bridge of boats alongside the ancient stone span, creating an escape route if needed. But divine favor, it seems, has switched sides with the morning light. Constantine's cavalry smashes into Maxentius's lines with supernatural fury. Soldiers who fight beneath the Christian symbol seem possessed by otherworldly strength. The armies of the old gods, blessed by proper augury and traditional sacrifice, crumble before the advance of men who carry the mark of the crucified God. Maxentius retreats across his boat bridge, but the structure collapses beneath the weight of his fleeing army. The rival emperor drowns in the Tiber's muddy waters, his body weighted down by the golden armor that was meant to display his divine favor. His head will soon decorate Constantine's triumphal procession, proof that the gods have chosen a new champion. But Constantine's victory brings a problem no Roman emperor has ever faced. What do you do when you owe your throne to a god your empire has been trying to destroy? The solution emerges through a series of careful, calculated moves that reveal Constantine's political genius. Rather than immediately proclaiming himself Christian, a declaration that would trigger civil war, he begins a delicate dance of transformation that will reshape the empire without destroying it. The Edict of Milan arrives in 313 AD like a thunderclap that no one quite hears. Issued jointly with his co-emperor Licinius, the edict grants religious freedom to all citizens of the empire, not just Christians, all religions. The language is carefully neutral, speaking of the divinity rather than Christ, of religious liberty rather than Christian triumph. To casual observers, it might seem like just another administrative reform, a bureaucratic adjustment to imperial policy. But those who understand the deeper currents of power recognize the edict's revolutionary implications. For the first time in Roman history, an emperor has declared that the state will not dictate religious practice. The ancient bond between political authority and divine favor, the fundamental assumption that the emperor must serve the gods who grant him victory, has been quietly severed. Constantine moves with the patience of a master chess player, each decision carefully calculated to advance his larger strategy. He begins funding the construction of Christian churches, but he also continues to support traditional Roman religious institutions. He appoints Christians to high government positions, but he maintains pagan senators and administrators. He mints coins bearing Christian symbols, but he also issues currency honoring Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god who has long been associated with imperial authority. The emperor's personal transformation unfolds gradually, publicly, dramatically. He delays his baptism, a common practice that allows for a lifetime of political compromise before the final commitment to Christian purity. He continues to serve as Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome's traditional religion, while simultaneously positioning himself as protector and patron of the Christian Church. This religious double life should create cognitive dissonance, but Constantine navigates it with remarkable skill. He reinterprets traditional Roman religious language in ways that accommodate Christian theology. Sol Invictus becomes a prefiguration of Christ, the earthly reflection of the true divine light. The imperial cult transforms from worship of the emperor's divinity to celebration of his role as God's chosen representative on earth. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD reveals the full scope of Constantine's ambitions. Faced with theological disputes that threaten to fracture the Christian movement, the emperor does something unprecedented. He summons bishops from across the empire to resolve doctrinal questions under imperial authority. The council's decisions will affect not just Christian belief, but imperial policy, creating a fusion of church and state that would have horrified earlier generations of Romans. Constantine presides over the council, not as a theologian, but as a politician who understands that religious unity serves political unity. He cares less about the precise nature of Christ's relationship to the Father than about ending the disputes that weaken Christian support for his regime. The Nicene Creed emerges from the council bearing the emperor's political fingerprints, as much as the bishop's theological insights. The establishment of Constantinople represents Constantine's most audacious gamble, the creation of a new Rome explicitly designed as a Christian capital. Built on the strategic site of ancient Byzantium, the new city rises without the accumulated religious traditions that make Rome itself a monument to paganism. No ancient temples crowd its hills, no ancestral gods claim its crossroads, no centuries of sacrificial blood sanctify its soil. Instead, Constantinople emerges as a city of churches, an imperial capital designed from the ground up to honor the Christian God. The emperor's new palace contains a private chapel rather than traditional household shrines. The hippodrome displays Christian symbols alongside traditional Roman imagery. The city's very architecture proclaims that a new age has begun, that the empire's spiritual center has shifted as dramatically as its political geography. Constantine's mother, Helena, embarks on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land that reads like a religious novel come to life. The aging empress scours Palestine for physical remnants of Christ's earthly ministry, transforming the sites of Christian memory into imperial destinations. She claims to discover the true cross buried beneath a pagan temple in Jerusalem, the very wood upon which the Savior died. Whether Helena's discoveries are authentic matters less than their political impact. The imperial family's personal investment in Christian holy sites transforms the religion's relationship with power. Christianity has always promised citizenship in heaven. Now it offers access to sacred places protected by imperial authority. Pilgrimage becomes not just spiritual exercise, but political statement, proof of loyalty to the new dispensation. The forged donation of Constantine, though created centuries later, captures the essential truth of what happens during this period. The emperor doesn't merely convert to Christianity, he remakes Christianity in the image of imperial authority. Bishops begin to dress like senators, adopting the purple-striped togas and golden ornaments of Roman aristocracy. Church hierarchy mirrors imperial administration, with metropolitan bishops governing ecclesiastical provinces that correspond to political territories. Christian symbols flood imperial imagery with calculated precision. The Chi-Rho appears on coins, standards, official seals, and architectural decorations. The cross, once a symbol of shame and criminal execution, becomes an emblem of imperial victory. Christian artists begin depicting Christ not as the suffering servant of Calvary, but as the cosmic emperor, seated on a heavenly throne and surrounded by the regalia of divine kingship. Yet Constantine's Christianity remains strategically ambiguous. He postpones baptism until his deathbed, maintaining theological flexibility that allows him to appeal to both Christian and pagan constituencies. He continues to consult traditional augurs alongside Christian bishops, blending old and new forms of divine consultation. His public pronouncements speak of the divinity or divine providence in language that Christians interpret as references to their God, while pagans hear echoes of traditional Roman religious terminology. The emperor's personal religious practice becomes a carefully choreographed performance designed to satisfy multiple audiences simultaneously. He attends Christian services, but also participates in traditional Roman ceremonies. He funds church construction, but also maintains temple repairs. He appoints Christian advisors, but retains pagan administrators. His religious policy operates on the principle that inclusion serves power better than exclusion. The transformation of imperial law reveals the deeper implications of Constantine's Christian turn. Legal reforms begin to reflect Christian moral principles. Divorce becomes more difficult. Infanticide receives harsher punishment. Slavery is gradually humanized through regulations that protect slaves' family relationships and religious observances. Yet these changes emerge gradually, presented as administrative improvements rather than religious revolution. Christian bishops find themselves wielding temporal power that exceeds anything they had imagined during the persecutions. They become judges in civil disputes, administrators of imperial charity, advisors on matters of state policy. The church develops its own bureaucracy that parallels and sometimes rivals imperial administration. Bishops begin to think like governors, managing territories and populations, rather than simply tending spiritual flocks. The economic implications of Constantine's conversion ripple through the empire's financial system. Christian churches receive imperial subsidies that dwarf the resources available to traditional temples. Christian clergy gain exemption from municipal taxes and civic obligations. Christian merchants find new opportunities in the imperial court, while pagan aristocrats discover that religious conversion can accelerate political advancement. Gold flows from imperial treasuries to fund massive church construction projects. The Lateran Basilica in Rome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem rise as monuments to the new alliance between Christian faith and imperial power. These buildings proclaim through stone and gold and precious decoration that Christianity has moved from the catacombs to the palace, from persecution to patronage. Yet beneath the surface of Constantine's religious revolution, older currents continue to flow. Pagan senators still sacrifice to household gods in private. Traditional festivals continue in modified forms. Mystery religions adapt their imagery and language to accommodate the new Christian environment. The empire's religious transformation proceeds through evolution rather than revolution, through adaptation rather than annihilation. Constantine dies in 337 AD, finally baptized on his deathbed by an Arian bishop whose theology the Council of Nicaea had condemned. Even in death, the emperor maintains his talent for religious ambiguity, receiving the sacrament from a representative of the very heresy his own council had rejected. His funeral combines Christian and pagan elements, imperial and ecclesiastical rituals, creating a ceremony that honors both the man who served Christ and the emperor who never quite stopped serving Caesar. The legacy of Constantine's gamble reshapes the empire's spiritual DNA. Christianity has gained imperial patronage, but it has also accepted imperial control. The Church has moved from the shadows into the light, but it has also become entangled with the very power structures its founder had rejected. The cross has conquered, but in conquering it has been conquered, transformed from a symbol of divine suffering into an emblem of earthly triumph. Future emperors will face a choice that Constantine's predecessors never confronted. They can be Christian or pagan, but they cannot be both. The careful balance that allowed Constantine to serve two masters simultaneously becomes impossible for his successors to maintain. The empire's religious future will be decided not through theological argument, but through political conflict. Not in council chambers, but on battlefields. Not by bishops, but by emperors who understand that in the new order, divine favor and political power have become inseparable. The old gods still receive their sacrifices in private houses and rural temples, but their grip on imperial destiny has been broken. A new god sits on heaven's throne, and his earthly representative carries a Roman sword blessed by Christian prayers. The transformation that began in Constantine's vision will soon accelerate beyond any emperor's ability to control, carrying the empire toward a future that neither pagan nor Christian could have imagined when the first cross appeared in the dawn sky above the Milvian Bridge. In the imperial palace at Constantinople, a 20-year-old prince sits in a room lined with forbidden books, his fingers tracing ancient Greek words by candlelight, while Christian guards patrol the corridors outside. Julian Flavius Claudius should not exist. When his uncle Constantine died 24 years ago, the imperial succession was supposed to belong to Constantine's sons, good Christian princes raised in the new faith, baptized in holy water, schooled by bishops who would guide the empire deeper into Christ's embrace. But palace politics moves like a plague through royal bloodlines, and when the dust settles from the dynastic murders that followed Constantine's death, only Julian and his older brother Gallus remain alive from their branch of the imperial family. The surviving princes become living proof of Christian mercy. Rather than executing potential rivals, the imperial court decides to neutralize them through education, a spiritual lobotomy performed with scripture and theology rather than blade and poison. Julian is handed over to Eusebius of Nicomedia, the Arian bishop who baptized Constantine on his deathbed, with orders to transform this dangerous pagan bloodline into harmless Christian scholarship. The irony would be amusing if it were not so tragic. Eusebius, the same bishop whose theology the Council of Nicaea condemned as heretical, becomes responsible for raising the boy who will grow up to threaten Christianity itself. Under the bishop's tutelage, Julian studies Christian doctrine with the intensity of a future priest, memorizes vast passages of scripture, learns to debate theological fine points with the skill of a trained ecclesiastic. But in the depths of the palace library, Julian discovers older books, stranger wisdom, more dangerous truths, hidden among the Christian texts, or perhaps deliberately placed there by sympathizers who understand what this young prince might become. He finds the works of Homer and Plato, the writings of Plotinus and Porphyry, the secret teachings of the Neoplatonists who keep alive the dying flame of classical wisdom. These books speak to something deep in Julian's soul, something that Christian education has tried to bury but cannot kill. They whisper of gods older than Christ, of philosophical truths that transcend the simplified morality of the Galilean, of a cosmic order more complex and beautiful than anything the bishops teach. Late at night, while his Christian tutors sleep, Julian performs secret rituals learned from ancient texts, offering wine to household gods whose names he barely knows how to pronounce. The young prince grows into manhood, carrying a double life that would have impressed Constantine himself. By day, he plays the role of the pious Christian intellectual, attending services, participating in theological discussions, even considering a career in the church. By night, he immerses himself in the mystical traditions that promise direct contact with the divine powers, the gods who once ruled the world before the Nazarenes' followers drove them into exile. When Julian's brother Gallus is executed in 354 AD, another victim of imperial paranoia about potential rivals, Julian should expect the same fate. Instead, Emperor Constantius II makes a decision that will haunt Christianity for centuries. He sends Julian to Athens to complete his philosophical education, placing the future apostate emperor in the very heart of pagan intellectual resistance. Athens in the 4th century remains what it has always been, the empire's university, the place where young aristocrats go to acquire the cultural polish that marks true civilization. But beneath its academic respectability, the city harbors something far more dangerous, a network of philosophers, teachers, and mystics who keep alive the old wisdom, the old gods, the old dreams of human potential that Christianity seeks to extinguish. Here, Julian encounters Libanius, the greatest orator of his generation, whose lectures on classical literature become subtle arguments for pagan superiority. Here he meets Maximus of Ephesus, the Neoplatonist magician who claims the ability to make statues weep and flames burn without fuel. Here he discovers a community of intellectuals who see Christianity not as divine revelation, but as barbarous superstition, not as the fulfillment of human spiritual longing, but as its betrayal. Under Maximus's guidance, Julian undergoes initiation into the mysteries of Mithras, the soldier's god whose underground temples honeycomb the empire like a secret nervous system. In darkness, lit only by ritual flames, Julian experiences what he believes to be direct contact with the divine powers, visions that convince him that the old gods have not died but merely withdrawn, waiting for a champion who will restore their worship and drive the Galilean pretender from his stolen throne. The rituals transform Julian's secret paganism into militant conviction. He begins to see himself not merely as a student of classical culture, but as a chosen instrument of divine restoration, a philosophical emperor in the tradition of Marcus Aurelius and Antoninus Pius, who will heal the spiritual wounds that Constantine's conversion has inflicted upon the empire. Yet Julian's paganism is not the simple polytheism of earlier centuries. His faith has been forged in opposition to Christianity, shaped by centuries of theological development that have made both religions more sophisticated than their predecessors. Julian's gods are not merely powerful beings who demand sacrifice and offer favor. They are cosmic principles accessible through philosophical contemplation, mystical experience, and ritualized communion. He envisions a reformed paganism that can compete with Christianity on intellectual and moral grounds. His gods will offer not just earthly benefits, but eternal salvation. His temples will provide not just ritual sacrifice, but systematic theology. His priests will minister not just to the powerful, but to the poor, creating charitable institutions that rival Christian welfare systems. In 361 AD, Emperor Constantius II dies without a direct heir, and the purple passes to the last surviving member of Constantine's dynasty, Julian, the prince whose Christian education has prepared him to become paganism's most formidable enemy. Julian's accession to power unleashes energies that have been building for decades in the empire's intellectual underground. The new emperor wastes no time in revealing his true allegiances. Within months of taking the throne, he issues proclamations that earthquake through the Christian establishment like aftershocks from a theological catastrophe. Christian teachers are banned from instructing students in classical literature, not because the books themselves are forbidden, but because Julian claims that only those who believe in the gods celebrated by Homer and Virgil can honestly teach their works. The policy strikes at Christianity's intellectual foundation, forcing Christian educators to choose between their faith and their livelihoods. Pagan temples closed by Constantine and his successors receive imperial orders to reopen. Priests who have survived decades of marginalization emerge from hiding to resume ancient rituals that have not been performed publicly for generations. Sacrificial smoke begins to rise again from altars, that Christian authorities had thought permanently extinguished. Julian himself participates in these ceremonies with an enthusiasm that startles even his pagan supporters. The emperor, who was raised on Christian theology, approaches pagan ritual with convert zeal, sacrificing hundreds of bulls in a single ceremony, performing complex purifications that require him to stand naked in sacred pools, while priests chant invocations in languages that predate Latin itself. The revival extends beyond mere ceremony into systematic theological reconstruction. Julian begins composing works that attempt to provide paganism with the kind of systematic doctrine that has made Christianity so effective. His Against the Galileans represents perhaps the most sophisticated intellectual attack on Christian theology ever produced, arguing that Christ's followers have corrupted both Jewish monotheism and Greek philosophy to create a hybrid religion that satisfies neither reason nor revelation. Julian's critique cuts to Christianity's core weaknesses. If Christ is divine, why did he suffer and die like a mortal? If he is the universal savior, why did he appear only to one small nation at one moment in history? If his message is divine wisdom, why does it contradict the philosophical insights that humanity's greatest thinkers have achieved through reason? If his kingdom is not of this world, why do his followers seek earthly power with such determination? The emperor's theological arguments gain force from his personal example. Here is a ruler raised as a Christian, educated by bishops, thoroughly familiar with scripture and doctrine, who has examined the faith from within and found it wanting. His apostasy carries more weight than any external criticism because it comes from someone who understands exactly what he is rejecting. But Julian's intellectual assault on Christianity accompanies practical policies designed to strangle the Church's institutional power. Christian clergy lose their tax exemptions and special legal privileges. Church property confiscated from pagan temples must be returned to its original owners. Christian charitable institutions find their imperial funding redirected to competing pagan organizations. Most provocatively, Julian announces his intention to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, the very sanctuary that Christ allegedly prophesied would never be restored. Jewish communities across the empire, persecuted by Christian authorities for centuries, suddenly find themselves allies of a pagan emperor who sees their restoration as proof of Christianity's false prophecies. The temple project becomes a test of divine power that fascinates the entire empire. If Julian succeeds in rebuilding what Christ said would remain destroyed, then Christian claims about their God's prophetic authority crumble. If he fails, then pagan pretensions to divine favor will be publicly humiliated. Work begins on the temple site with ceremonies that blend Jewish tradition, pagan ritual, and imperial ceremony. Julian himself participates in groundbreaking rituals, offering sacrifices to gods whose names have not been invoked in Jerusalem for centuries. Jewish workers labor alongside pagan craftsmen and imperial engineers to create what they hope will be the most magnificent temple in the world. Then the earth begins to move. Witnesses report mysterious fires erupting from the foundation trenches, flames that cannot be extinguished and seem to burn without fuel. Workers flee as underground explosions shake the construction site. Some claim to see crosses of light appearing in the sky above Jerusalem, divine signatures that spell doom for the project. Julian's supporters dismiss the phenomena as Christian sabotage or natural gas ignition, but the emperor himself begins to doubt. His private letters reveal a man increasingly haunted by the possibility that he has misread divine will, that perhaps the Galilean possesses powers that pagan wisdom cannot comprehend. The doubts multiply as Julian's broader restoration program encounters unexpected obstacles. Pagan temples reopen, but attendance remains sparse. Sacrificial rituals resume, but many Romans have forgotten how to perform them properly. Priests trained in secret emerge to serve the ancient gods, but they lack the institutional knowledge that centuries of continuous practice had provided. Most troubling of all, Julian discovers that paganism itself has been changed by its confrontation with Christianity. The old tolerance for diverse religious practice has been replaced by an exclusivity that mirrors Christian claims to unique truth. Pagan intellectuals demand that their followers choose between the gods and Christ, rejecting the very flexibility that had once made polytheism so appealing. The emperor who had hoped to restore the empire's ancient spiritual harmony finds himself presiding over a religious war that he himself has declared. Christian mobs attack newly reopened temples. Pagan crowds vandalize Christian churches. Imperial troops find themselves policing religious violence that grows more intense with each passing month. Julian's own behavior becomes increasingly erratic as the pressures of his impossible project mount. He spends entire nights performing elaborate sacrificial rituals, seeking divine guidance that never seems to come clearly. He surrounds himself with philosophers and magicians whose advice becomes more desperate and contradictory as the emperor's policies fail to produce their promised results. The fatal decision comes in 363 AD when Julian launches a military campaign against Persia, partly to escape the religious conflicts consuming his domestic agenda, partly to prove that the old gods still grant victory to their faithful servants. The invasion begins with omens so unfavorable that even pagan priests counsel against it, but Julian has committed himself too deeply to retreat. The Persian campaign unfolds like a Greek tragedy, each act bringing the hero closer to his inevitable doom. Julian's army advances into enemy territory with initial success, but the deeper they penetrate into Persia, the more isolated they become. Supply lines stretch and break, local populations prove hostile. The Persian enemy refuses to offer the decisive battle that would allow Julian to demonstrate divine favor through military victory. On June 26, 363 AD, during a confused skirmish in the Mesopotamian desert, an enemy spear finds its way through the gaps in Julian's armor. The wound is not immediately fatal, but infection sets in during the night. By dawn, the last pagan emperor lies dying in his tent, while Christian officers whisper among themselves about the divine justice of his fate. Julian's final hours become the subject of competing legends that reveal more about their tellers than their subject. Christian sources claim that with his dying breath, he acknowledges Christ's victory, gasping, "You have conquered, Galilean," as his soul departs for whatever judgment awaits apostate emperors. Pagan accounts insist that he dies, calling upon the sun god, faithful to the end to the cosmic powers that Christianity seeks to overthrow. The truth matters less than the symbolism. Julian dies without an heir, without a designated successor, without even a clear indication of his final religious allegiance. His death marks not just the end of a reign, but the end of an era, the last moment when it seemed possible that the empire might return to its pagan past, the final chance for the old gods to reclaim their throne. The army that carries Julian's body back from Persia chooses as his successor Jovian, a Christian officer whose first act as emperor is to restore the church privileges that Julian had revoked. Pagan temples close again. Christian clergy resume their positions of influence. The temple in Jerusalem remains an unfinished ruin, its foundation trenches gradually filling with sand and debris as if the earth itself seeks to forget Julian's grandiose ambitions. Within a generation, Julian becomes a figure of legend rather than history. Christians remember him as Julian the Apostate, the cautionary tale of what happens when prideful intellect rejects divine grace. Pagans preserve his memory as the philosopher-emperor, the tragic hero who almost saved the ancient wisdom from Christian barbarism, but died too young to complete his mission. The reality is more complex and more tragic than either legend admits. Julian represents the last serious attempt to reverse the religious transformation that Constantine had initiated, the final effort to prove that the old gods could compete with the new faith on its own terms. His failure demonstrates not the weakness of paganism, but the impossibility of turning back the tide of history, the futility of trying to resurrect a spiritual world that has already died. Julian's death leaves the empire's pagan population orphaned, leaderless, facing a future in which their gods will be increasingly marginalized until they survive only as folklore, art, and half-remembered customs. The philosophical schools where Julian learned his anti-Christian arguments will gradually close. The temples where he performed his desperate sacrifices will be converted into churches or torn down for building materials. Most tragically, Julian's reign proves that paganism's greatest weakness was not its theology or its morality, but its inability to produce institutional structures capable of surviving political persecution. Christianity had developed its strength in opposition, forging underground networks that could endure imperial hostility. Paganism had grown comfortable with imperial support, becoming so dependent on state patronage that it could not function without political favor. The last pagan emperor dies not in glorious battle against Christianity's champions, but in a squalid border war fought for purely political reasons. His death comes not as the climax of a theological conflict, but as the random result of military confusion. The gods for whom he sacrificed hundreds of bulls prove unable to deflect a single Persian spear. Yet Julian's brief reign accomplishes something neither he nor his enemies anticipated. It forces both Christians and pagans to articulate their deepest convictions with unprecedented clarity. The intellectual arguments he raises against Christianity will echo through centuries of theological debate. The institutional reforms he attempts will provide models for later emperors seeking to manage religious diversity. Most importantly, Julian's failure marks the moment when Christianity's victory becomes irreversible. After 363 AD, no emperor will seriously attempt to restore pagan supremacy. The old gods will survive in art and literature, in private devotion and rural custom, but they will never again threaten Christian control of imperial power. The emperor who sought to become paganism's savior instead becomes its final victim, the last ruler to believe that philosophical argument and ritual purity could compete with the institutional power and popular appeal that Christianity has developed through 3 centuries of growth. His death closes forever the door that Constantine had opened, making the empire's Christian future as inevitable as the sunset that ends the last day of the pagan age. The smoke rises black against the Egyptian sky as the greatest temple in Alexandria burns. Inside the Serapeum, priests who have served the god Serapis for 40 years huddle in the sanctuary, while Christian mobs hammer at bronze doors that have never known violence. The temple library, second only to the legendary Museum of Alexandria in its collection of ancient wisdom, feeds the flames with scrolls that contain the mathematical insights of Euclid, the astronomical observations of Hipparchus, the philosophical meditations of countless thinkers whose names will now be lost forever. This is the year 391 AD, and Emperor Theodosius I has finally issued the decree that 3 generations of Christians have awaited. Paganism is not merely discouraged or restricted, it is illegal. The old gods are declared demons, their priests become criminals, their worshippers face fines, imprisonment, exile, or death. The war against the gods begins not with imperial proclamation, but with the sound of hammers against marble, the crash of bronze statues toppling from their pedestals, the screams of priests who discover that Christian mercy has limits that do not extend to the servants of false deities. Julian's death 17 years earlier had closed the door on pagan political power, but it had not eliminated pagan spiritual presence. Across the empire, temples continued to function in the shadows, performing ancient rituals for dwindling congregations who hoped that imperial attention would turn elsewhere. Rural shrines maintained their ancient festivals. Urban mystery religions practiced their secret initiations. Philosophical schools continued to teach the wisdom of Plato and Plotinus alongside grudging acknowledgement of Christian theology. This twilight existence ends when Theodosius decides that tolerance has become a luxury the empire can no longer afford. The Theodosian decrees descend upon the pagan world like a series of hammer blows, each successive law driving another nail into the coffin of the old religious order. The first decree, issued in 391 AD, strikes at the economic foundation of pagan religion. Temple lands are confiscated and transferred to Christian institutions. Sacrificial ceremonies are banned under penalty of death. Priests lose their legal recognition and their right to perform marriages, conduct funerals, or administrate sacred oaths. The vast temple economies that have supported thousands of craftsmen, servants, and dependents collapse overnight as imperial patronage shifts entirely to Christian institutions, but legal prohibition proves insufficient to eliminate religious practice that has roots reaching back over a millennium. The second wave of legislation, issued in 392 AD, targets pagan worship in private spaces. Household shrines must be destroyed. Ancestral festivals are forbidden. Even the simple act of pouring wine for the Lares becomes a criminal offense punishable by confiscation of property. The laws transform ordinary Romans into criminals for practices their families have followed for centuries. A farmer who leaves bread for the field spirits faces the same legal penalties as a murderer. A mother who prays to Juno for her child's health risks losing her home. A merchant who honors Mercury before a business journey can be denounced by his slaves and stripped of his possessions. Enforcement comes not through imperial officials, but through a new institution that will haunt the empire's memory for centuries: the Christian mob. In cities across the Mediterranean, zealous believers take Theodosius's decrees as divine authorization for holy violence. They pour into the streets carrying crosses like weapons, chanting psalms like war songs, descending upon pagan shrines with the righteousness of soldiers in God's army. The destruction follows predictable patterns that reveal both careful organization and spontaneous fury. Christian crowds gather at pagan temples during major festivals, when the contrast between old and new worship becomes most visible. They arrive armed with hammers, crowbars, and torches, but also with theological arguments that justify their violence as divine service. Watch them tear down the statue of Athena that has guarded the Parthenon for 800 years. The goddess's marble face, carved by sculptors whose names have outlived empires, shatters against the temple steps as Christians cheer the fall of another demon. The owl that perches on her shoulder, ancient symbol of wisdom, becomes kindling for the fires that will melt down her bronze spear. Watch them storm the Mithraeum beneath the church of San Clemente in Rome. That underground sanctuary where soldiers have sworn oaths to the unconquered sun for 3 centuries. The sacred bull, whose eternal sacrifice promised rebirth to the faithful, disappears under Christian hammers. The astronomical ceiling that mapped the cosmos for initiates becomes rubble to fill the foundation trenches of a Christian basilica. Watch them destroy the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, whose silver cult statues have generated wealth for the entire region since before Rome existed. The goddess who protected women in childbirth, who governed the hunt and the harvest, who promised that virgin strength could triumph over masculine force, dies in flames that light the Aegean sky for 3 days. The violence spreads beyond temples to target the people who serve them. Pagan priests face choices that echo the dilemmas their Christian predecessors confronted during the persecutions: conversion, exile, or death. But the pagans lack the institutional networks that allowed Christianity to survive imperial hostility. Their priesthoods are hereditary rather than institutional, their wisdom oral rather than written, their communities local rather than universal. When the last priest of Jupiter dies without training a successor, the rituals he has performed for 50 years die with him. When the final priestess of Vesta is forced to abandon her temple, the eternal flame that has burned for 1,000 years finally gutters out. When the haruspices who read divine will in sacrificial entrails are banned from practicing their art, the empire loses its ability to consult the gods about the future, a skill that Romans have relied upon for every major decision since the city's founding. The destruction of the Serapeum in Alexandria becomes the symbolic climax of Christian triumph. The temple complex, built by the Ptolemies to rival the greatest shrines of Greece and Rome, stands 90 feet high, its bronze doors decorated with scenes from Egyptian mythology, its halls filled with statues of gods whose worship stretches back to the pharaohs. Inside, the god Serapis sits upon his throne, a massive chryselephantine figure whose golden robes and ivory skin reflect the devotion of generations of worshippers. Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria leads the assault personally, his white vestments stark against the temple's colored marble as he raises a ceremonial hammer to strike the first blow against Serapis's statue. The god's face, carved with the serene authority of divine kingship, shows no expression as Christian hammers reduce it to fragments. His hands, which once blessed pilgrims from across the Mediterranean, become rubble to pave Christian streets. The destruction takes 3 days. Each room of the temple complex yields new treasures for the fires: bronze cult implements that predate Alexander's conquest, papyrus scrolls containing hymns in languages that no living person can read, astronomical instruments that map the movements of planets for priests who saw divine meaning in celestial patterns. As the Serapeum burns, something dies in Alexandria that will never be reborn. The city has been the empire's intellectual capital, the place where Greek philosophy and Egyptian wisdom and Roman law converged to create new forms of human understanding. The temple library has preserved texts that exist nowhere else, ideas that represent the culmination of centuries of scholarly labor, insights that might have illuminated human knowledge for generations to come. The flames consume works of mathematics that will not be rediscovered for 1,000 years. They destroy astronomical observations that took centuries to accumulate. They eliminate philosophical treatises that might have provided alternatives to the Christian worldview that is now reshaping human consciousness. The smoke that rises from the Serapeum carries with it the death of intellectual diversity, the end of the pluralistic culture that had allowed multiple approaches to truth to coexist within the empire's boundaries. But the Christian assault on paganism extends beyond mere destruction to active transformation of the religious landscape. Churches rise on the foundations of demolished temples, their altars positioned directly above the spots where pagan sacrifices once flowed. The message is clear: the new God has not merely defeated the old gods, but has occupied their territory, claimed their sacred spaces, absorbed their power. This process of religious colonization follows patterns that will echo through centuries of Christian expansion. Pagan festivals become Christian holy days, their timing preserved, but their meaning transformed. The winter solstice celebration of Sol Invictus becomes Christmas, honoring the birth of the true light of the world. The spring fertility rites dedicated to Venus become Easter celebrations of resurrection and new life. The harvest festivals that thanked Ceres for her bounty become Thanksgiving services that praise the Christian God for his providence. Pagan sacred sites undergo similar transformation. The cave where Mithras was born becomes the grotto where Christ's nativity is celebrated. The grove where Diana hunted becomes the shrine where a virgin saint performed miracles. The spring where nymphs once dwelt becomes the baptismal font where Christians are reborn in divine grace. Christian bishops emerge as the new power brokers in this transformed religious landscape. Men like Ambrose of Milan discover that their spiritual authority translates into political influence that can rival imperial power itself. When Emperor Theodosius orders the massacre of 7,000 civilians in Thessalonica as punishment for a riot, Bishop Ambrose excommunicates the emperor and bars him from entering church until he performs public penance. The sight of the most powerful man in the world standing barefoot outside a church door, begging forgiveness from a bishop, marks a revolutionary moment in the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. The emperor, who commands legions and governs provinces, must humble himself before a priest who claims to represent divine justice. The imperial purple that once signified absolute power becomes subordinate to the episcopal ring that channels heavenly authority. This new Christian politics operates through networks that span the empire and extend beyond its borders. Bishops communicate with each other through letter systems that rival imperial administration in their efficiency. They coordinate policies across provincial boundaries, sharing information about heretical movements, pagan resistance, and political opportunities. They develop legal theories that justify Christian authority over civil matters, arguing that divine law supersedes human legislation when the two conflict. The economic implications of Christian triumph reshape the empire's financial structure. Temple wealth accumulated over centuries flows into church treasuries through confiscation and conversion. Christian institutions become major landowners, employing thousands of workers and generating revenues that fund massive construction projects. The church develops its own banking systems, lending money at interest and investing in commercial ventures that make bishops into merchant princes. Christian charity becomes a political weapon as effective as any military force. Where pagan temples had provided limited welfare for their immediate communities, Christian churches create empire-wide networks of poor relief, medical care, and social services. Pagans who resist conversion find themselves excluded from institutions that provide food during famines, medical care during epidemics, and legal protection during conflicts. The transformation extends beyond politics and economics into the realm of law itself. The Roman legal system, developed over centuries to accommodate the empire's religious diversity, undergoes systematic revision to reflect Christian moral principles. Adultery receives harsher punishment. Divorce becomes more difficult to obtain. Sunday becomes an official day of rest. Christian holidays gain legal recognition, while pagan festivals lose their protected status. Most significantly, the legal definition of treason expands to include religious offences. Citizens who persist in pagan worship face charges of lese-majesty, crimes against imperial authority, because the emperor now governs as God's representative on earth. Religious dissent becomes political rebellion. Spiritual nonconformity becomes civil disobedience. Theological disagreement becomes treasonous resistance. The assault on pagan learning accompanies the destruction of pagan worship. Christian emperors closed the philosophical schools that have operated in Athens for 800 years, arguing that institutions dedicated to pagan wisdom cannot coexist with Christian truth. The academy where Plato taught and the Lyceum where Aristotle lectured fall silent as their last teachers flee into exile or convert to Christianity. Libraries throughout the empire undergo systematic purification. Books deemed incompatible with Christian doctrine disappear from public collections, their parchment recycled for Christian texts, or their papyrus burned to heat Christian bathhouses. The accumulated learning of classical antiquity survives only in fragments, often preserved by accident rather than design, copied by scribes who may not understand the significance of what they are preserving. The murder of Hypatia in Alexandria in 415 AD becomes the symbolic culmination of Christianity's war against pagan intellectualism. The brilliant mathematician and philosopher, whose lectures draw students from across the Mediterranean, represents everything that the new order seeks to eliminate: female authority, intellectual independence, philosophical approaches to truth that compete with revealed religion. When Hypatia's carriage is stopped by a Christian mob led by Peter the Lector, she faces accusations that transcend mere religious disagreement. She is charged with witchcraft because her mathematical insights seem supernatural to those who cannot comprehend them. She is accused of political conspiracy because her influence over Alexandria's governor threatens episcopal authority. She is condemned for spiritual pride because her commitment to philosophical truth appears to claim knowledge that should belong only to God. The mob drags Hypatia from her carriage and into the Caesareum, the temple that once honored Augustus but now serves as a Christian church. There, using broken pottery shards as weapons, they flay the flesh from her bones while chanting hymns of praise. Her dismembered body is burned on a pyre that consumes not only her flesh, but the intellectual tradition she represented. Hypatia's death sends a message that echoes through every corner of the empire where pagan learning still flourishes. Intellectual independence cannot coexist with Christian authority. Scholars who wish to survive must choose between their commitment to open inquiry and their personal safety. Most choose safety, converting to Christianity, and redirecting their intellectual efforts toward theological questions deemed acceptable by episcopal oversight. The pagan resistance that emerges in response to Christian persecution lacks the institutional coherence that had made Christianity so successful during its underground years. Pagan worship becomes fragmentary, localized, dependent on individual charisma rather than systematic organization. Rural communities maintain ancient festivals in modified forms, calling them harvest celebrations or seasonal customs rather than religious ceremonies. Urban intellectuals preserve classical texts by copying them in private, often disguising pagan philosophy as historical curiosity rather than living wisdom. Some pagans attempt more organized resistance. In Gaul, Celtic Druids lead revolts that combine religious restoration with political independence, seeking to overthrow both Christian authority and Roman rule. In Egypt, desert hermits who had once served Isis and Serapis become Christian monks, transforming their religious impulses rather than abandoning them entirely. In Greece, Neoplatonic philosophers develop increasingly esoteric doctrines that claim compatibility with Christianity, while preserving pagan metaphysical insights. But these resistance movements lack the resources and coordination necessary to challenge Christian dominance effectively. The Church has inherited not only imperial patronage, but also imperial administrative techniques, creating institutions capable of governing both souls and societies. Pagan resistance remains reactive rather than proactive, defensive rather than expansive, nostalgic rather than innovative. By the end of the 4th century, the war against the gods has achieved its essential objectives. Public pagan worship has been eliminated throughout most of the empire. Temple economies have been dismantled and their resources redirected to Christian institutions. Pagan priesthoods have been dissolved and their social functions transferred to Christian clergy. The legal framework that once protected religious diversity has been replaced by legislation that enforces Christian conformity. Yet the victory comes at a cost that few Christians anticipated when they first began praying for the empire's conversion. The destruction of pagan institutions eliminates not only false worship, but also cultural traditions that had enriched human experience for millennia. The silencing of pagan voices removes from public discourse philosophical perspectives that might have provided valuable alternatives to Christian orthodoxy. The burning of pagan books destroys knowledge that might have advanced human understanding in directions that purely Christian scholarship cannot imagine. Most tragically, the triumph of Christian exclusivity eliminates the very tolerance that had allowed Christianity itself to develop within the empire's religious ecosystem. The Church that had once benefited from Rome's willingness to accommodate diverse spiritual traditions now demonstrates that it will not extend the same courtesy to its competitors. The faith that had once appealed to converts through the attractiveness of its message now maintains its dominance through the threat of legal punishment and social ostracism. The empire that had once grown strong through its ability to absorb and integrate diverse cultures now commits itself to a single religious vision that demands the elimination of all alternatives. The cosmic religious harmony that had once made Rome seem capable of encompassing all human spiritual aspirations gives way to a theological uniformity that achieves order at the expense of vitality. The last pagan emperor is dead. The last great temples lie in ruins. The last public priesthoods have been dissolved. The old gods who once ruled the world from marble thrones now survive only as folklore, as artistic motifs, as half-remembered customs practiced in secret by people who no longer fully understand their original meanings. But the gods, it seems, are harder to kill than their temples. In the darkness beneath the empire's Christian surface, older powers continue to move, waiting for new forms of expression, new ways to touch human hearts that no amount of imperial legislation can completely seal. The war against the gods has ended in Christian victory, but victory over enemies who refuse to acknowledge defeat may prove more complex than the victors imagined. In the countryside beyond Rome, an old woman kneels in a grove where her grandmother once left honeycakes for the spirits of the oak trees. Her hands shake as she pours wine onto the earth, whispering words in a dialect that is dying with her generation. She glances over her shoulder, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps, for the voices of neighbors who might report her to the village priest. The ritual that once marked the turning of seasons for entire communities now belongs to the shadows, performed in secret by people who remember when the world was full of gods. This is the year 420 AD, 30 years after Theodosius banned pagan worship, and the old woman is one of the last. When she dies, her knowledge will die with her. The prayers that called rain in drought years, the songs that blessed newborn children, the stories that explained why the wind moves through the trees at night. Her grandchildren have been baptized as Christians. They speak Latin rather than the local tongue. They cross themselves when they pass the grove, making the sign that banishes the demons their grandmother still calls gods. The death of pagan Rome is not a single event, but a slow hemorrhaging that drains the empire's spiritual lifeblood drop by drop, year by year, generation by generation. What dies is not merely a collection of religious practices, but an entire way of experiencing the world, a cosmic ecology that had sustained human communities for over 1,000 years. Watch the calendar empty of meaning as the ancient festivals disappear one by one. February arrives without the Lupercalia, that wild celebration when young men ran naked through Roman streets, striking women with goatskin thongs to ensure fertility for the coming year. The ritual had connected Romans to their most primitive instincts, to the wolf mothers who nursed Romulus and Remus, to the animal energies that civilization seeks to domesticate but never completely tame. Without the Lupercalia, February becomes just another month, 40 days of winter cold without the explosive release that had once promised spring's eventual return. Roman women who had once laughed and fled from the sacred runners now huddle in their houses, praying to a virgin saint for the children that pagan magic had once guaranteed. March passes without the Salii dancing through the forum, those warrior priests who carried the sacred shields of Mars while performing ritual leaps that kept the gods' favor strong. Their bronze armor had clanged like music through the streets. Their ancient songs had preserved memories of Rome's earliest victories. Their presence had reminded every citizen that the empire's military might rested on divine foundations older than law or constitution. Without the Salii, March becomes merely the month when soldiers receive their orders for the summer campaigns. The shields that once channeled Mars's power gather dust in forgotten temples. The songs that once invoked victory before battle fade into silence. Roman legions march to war carrying Christian crosses instead of the god's protection, praying to a Prince of Peace for success in enterprises that require the blessing of the Lord of War. May arrives without the Floralia, when prostitutes had danced naked in the streets, while flowers rained from every window, and Romans celebrated the triumph of Venus over winter's death. The festival had acknowledged sexuality as divine force, fertility as cosmic power, pleasure as spiritual practice that connected mortal flesh to immortal energies. Without the Floralia, May becomes just another spring month, notable only for its Christian feast days that celebrate virgin martyrs and celibate saints. The flowers still bloom, but they adorn church altars rather than Venus's statues. The dancing continues, but in forms that praise spiritual rather than physical ecstasy. The goddess, who had taught Romans that love creates life, disappears into theological categories that divide flesh from spirit, body from soul, earth from heaven. The vanishing festivals leave gaps in time itself, empty spaces where ritual meaning had once provided rhythm for human experience. Roman children grow up without the cyclical celebrations that had once marked their progress through the seasons of life. They are baptized as infants, but never experience the puberty rites that had once initiated them into adult spiritual responsibilities. They marry in Christian ceremonies but never participate in the ancient rituals that had once bound their unions to cosmic forces larger than individual desire. Most tragically, they die without the elaborate funeral customs that had once guaranteed their peaceful passage to whatever lies beyond death. Roman burial practice had been a complex negotiation between the living and the dead, a theological technology that ensured the deceased would find rest while the survivors maintained connection to ancestral wisdom. Bodies were prepared with rituals that honored both individual identity and family continuity. Graves were supplied with food and drink and precious objects that the dead might need in their journey to the underworld. Christian burial simplifies this complex relationship into crude binary: saved or damned, heaven or hell, eternal bliss or eternal torment. The elaborate negotiations between worlds that had once occupied priests and families for weeks become brief prayers that commit souls to divine mercy without human mediation. The dead disappear into theological abstractions rather than remaining present as spiritual advisors and ancestral guardians. The loss extends beyond ritual into the very structure of religious authority. Pagan priesthoods had been hereditary institutions that preserved knowledge across generations through family transmission. A priest of Jupiter inherited not only his office, but also centuries of accumulated wisdom about ritual procedure, theological interpretation, and divine communication. His daughters might serve as priestesses, his sons might become augurs, his entire family might participate in maintaining the relationship between their community and the gods. Christian clergy, by contrast, are recruited through individual calling rather than family tradition. They are trained in seminaries rather than raised in temple households. They learn theology from books rather than inheriting it through blood. When a Christian priest dies, his knowledge dies with him unless it has been written down in forms that can be transmitted to strangers. This shift from hereditary to institutional authority breaks the chains of memory that had connected Roman communities to their spiritual origins. Ancient songs are forgotten because no one inherits the responsibility to sing them. Sacred stories disappear because no one learns them at their grandmother's knee. Ritual knowledge evaporates because it cannot be preserved in books, but must be passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. The haruspices who read divine will in sacrificial entrails represent the most tragic loss of all. These specialists had spent decades learning to interpret the subtle signs that revealed heavenly intentions: the texture of liver tissue, the color variations in lung membranes, the positioning of heart chambers that indicated divine favor or disfavor. Their art required not only technical skill, but also spiritual sensitivity that connected human consciousness to cosmic consciousness through the medium of animal sacrifice. When the last haruspix dies without training a successor, Rome loses its ability to consult the gods about the future. Emperors who once delayed military campaigns because the omens proved unfavorable now launch invasions based purely on political calculation. Merchants who once timed their voyages according to divine guidance now trust only to weather patterns and market conditions. Farmers who once planted their crops when the gods indicated favorable conditions now rely on agricultural manuals that describe soil conditions but ignore spiritual factors. The empire's decision-making process becomes entirely secular, cut off from the divine counsel that had guided Roman choices for 8 centuries. Politicians who once sought heavenly approval for their policies now answer only to human constituencies. Generals who once waited for divine endorsement before engaging enemies now fight according to purely tactical considerations. The cosmic dimension of human choice disappears, leaving Romans to navigate their challenges without the spiritual resources that had once made their empire seem divinely destined for greatness. Rural paganism dies the slowest death, lingering in remote villages where imperial authority reaches lightly and Christian conversion proceeds gradually. In the mountains of Wales, Celtic druids continue to perform seasonal rituals in groves that Christian missionaries have not yet discovered. In the forests of Germany, tribal priests maintain ancient shrines where Germanic gods receive offerings from communities that nominally accept Christian authority, but privately preserve older loyalties. These rural pagans, the Pagani who give their name to all non-Christian religion, develop strategies of resistance that will echo through centuries of religious persecution. They disguise pagan festivals as harvest celebrations, calling them secular customs rather than religious ceremonies. They preserve pagan stories as folklore, presenting them as entertainment rather than theology. They maintain pagan rituals as family traditions, claiming they honor ancestors rather than gods. But rural resistance cannot preserve the full complexity of pagan religious life. Without urban temples to provide institutional support, without imperial patronage to fund elaborate ceremonies, without philosophical schools to develop sophisticated theology, paganism survives only in fragmentary forms that gradually lose their original meaning. The sacred groves where druids once taught cosmic wisdom become hiding places for outlaws and refugees. The standing stones that once marked sacred geography become boundary markers for Christian estates. The holy wells where communities once gathered to honor water spirits become sources of Christian miracles, their pagan history gradually forgotten as new legends replace old ones. Most heartbreaking of all, the rural populations that preserve pagan traditions begin to lose the ability to understand their own customs. Festivals continue to be celebrated, but the theological reasons for their celebration fade from memory. Rituals continue to be performed, but their symbolic meaning becomes obscure to the people who perform them. Stories continue to be told, but their religious significance transforms into mere entertainment. Christian authorities often tolerate these survivals precisely because they have lost their spiritual power. A harvest festival that honors agricultural abundance poses no threat to Christian theology if the participants no longer remember that they are actually celebrating Ceres's gift of grain to humanity. A story about gods and heroes creates no competition for Christian doctrine if the audience understands it as fiction rather than revelation. Yet even in their degraded forms, these pagan survivals carry genetic traces of the spiritual ecosystem that Christianity has destroyed. The Christmas tree that decorates Christian homes preserves memories of Germanic tree worship. The Easter eggs that celebrate Christian resurrection echo ancient fertility rituals dedicated to spring goddesses. The Halloween costumes that terrify Christian children maintain connections to Celtic beliefs about the permeable boundary between life and death. The empire's intellectual life suffers losses that prove even more devastating than the disappearance of ritual practice. The destruction of pagan libraries eliminates not only religious texts, but also scientific, mathematical, and philosophical works that had represented the pinnacle of ancient learning. When Christian mobs burn the books in Alexandria's temples, they destroy astronomical observations that had taken centuries to accumulate, mathematical insights that would not be rediscovered for 1,000 years, medical knowledge that might have saved countless lives. The loss extends beyond specific texts to entire approaches to knowledge that had flourished under pagan patronage. Ancient scientists had viewed the natural world as divine revelation, studying astronomy as theology, pursuing mathematics as mystical practice, investigating medicine as spiritual discipline. Their research had been motivated not merely by practical concerns, but by religious conviction that understanding nature meant understanding the gods. Christian intellectual life, by contrast, subordinates natural investigation to theological orthodoxy. Scientific inquiry becomes acceptable only when it supports religious doctrine or serves practical needs approved by ecclesiastical authority. Astronomical research focuses on calculating Easter dates rather than exploring cosmic structure. Mathematical study concentrates on architectural problems for church construction rather than pursuing abstract theoretical insights. Medical practice emphasizes prayer and miraculous healing rather than systematic anatomical investigation. The philosophical schools that had nurtured human reasoning for 8 centuries closed their doors forever when Christian emperors banned pagan education. The academy, where Plato had taught students to seek truth through dialectical reasoning, becomes a casualty of religious warfare. The Lyceum, where Aristotle had developed systematic approaches to logic and ethics, falls silent as its last teachers flee into exile or convert to Christianity. With the closure of these institutions, the empire loses its capacity to train philosophers who can think independently about fundamental questions of human existence. Christian seminaries produce theologians who can interpret scripture and defend orthodox doctrine, but they cannot replace the intellectual environment that had encouraged free inquiry into the nature of reality, knowledge, and value. The urban culture that had sustained pagan intellectual life undergoes systematic transformation as Christian institutions replace secular ones. Public baths where Romans had once gathered to discuss philosophy and politics become sites of Christian preaching about the sinfulness of bodily pleasure. Libraries that had once preserved diverse intellectual traditions become repositories for Christian texts that crowd out alternative perspectives. Schools that had once taught rhetoric and mathematics and astronomy become catechetical institutions focused primarily on religious instruction. The very architecture of Roman cities reflects the spiritual transformation that eliminates pagan presence from public space. Temples that had once dominated urban skylines disappear beneath Christian churches that assert new claims to divine authority. Forum spaces that had once accommodated diverse religious ceremonies become exclusively Christian precincts where only Orthodox worship is permitted. Statues of gods that had once provided spiritual focus for urban communities become building materials for churches that proclaim the triumph of the true faith over false deities. By the time Pope Gelasius finally abolishes the Lupercalia in 494 AD, over a century after Theodosius banned pagan worship, the festival has already become a shadow of its former self, performed by Romans who no longer fully understand its meaning or believe in its power. The Pope's decree eliminates not a living religious practice, but a cultural memory that has survived primarily through institutional inertia rather than genuine spiritual conviction. The death of the Lupercalia marks the end of the last major pagan festival to maintain official recognition in the Christian Empire. With its abolition, the transformation that began with Constantine's vision at the Milvian Bridge reaches completion. The Roman calendar, once pulsing with divine appointments that connected human time to cosmic time, becomes a purely Christian construction that recognizes only saints' days and ecclesiastical celebrations. Yet the empire's pagan past cannot be completely erased because it has become too deeply embedded in the foundations of Roman culture. The Latin language that carries Christian doctrine remains filled with words that assume pagan theological categories. Legal concepts that govern Christian society derive from principles developed under pagan auspices. Artistic traditions that decorate Christian churches preserve aesthetic insights first developed in pagan temples. Most ironically, the very administrative structures that enable Christian triumph over paganism were originally designed to accommodate religious diversity rather than enforce religious uniformity. The imperial bureaucracy that now persecutes pagan worship had once protected it. the legal framework that now criminalizes pagan practice had once guaranteed its freedom. The political institutions that now serve Christian orthodoxy had once embodied pagan values of tolerance and inclusion. The death of pagan Rome represents not merely the victory of one religion over others, but the transformation of the empire's fundamental character from pluralistic to monolithic, from inclusive to exclusive, from tolerant to orthodox. The Roman genius for absorbing and integrating diverse cultures gives way to a Christian insistence on converting and transforming all alternatives to fit a single theological template. What dies with the last pagan rituals is a way of being human that had allowed for multiple approaches to the sacred, diverse methods of divine communication, alternative visions of human flourishing. The rich ecosystem of spiritual practice that had once sustained communities across the Mediterranean world collapses into a monoculture that achieves unity at the expense of vitality. In remote corners of the empire, old women still whisper prayers to gods whose names they can barely remember. In abandoned temples, wind moves through broken columns that once echoed with hymns of praise. In sacred groves, trees continue their ancient growth, but no one remembers the stories that once explained their spiritual significance. The gods are dying, but they die slowly, reluctantly, incompletely. Something in the human heart continues to hunger for the divine multiplicity that paganism had offered, for the cosmic ecology that had connected Earth to heaven through 1,000 different paths. That hunger will outlive the empire itself, waiting for new forms of expression that can satisfy spiritual longings that even the most triumphant orthodoxy cannot completely eliminate. In a church in Rome, a mosaic glows with golden light that seems to move like living fire around the head of Christ. The halo burns with the same radiance that once crowned Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun who had blessed Constantine's armies and guided his vision at the Milvian Bridge. The artist who crafted this sacred image has never heard of the sun god, born 3 centuries after Theodosius banned pagan worship. Yet his hands, guided by traditions that flow like underground rivers beneath the empire's Christian surface, have recreated the divine solar crown that marked celestial authority for 1,000 years before Christ claimed it as his own. The gods are dead. The temples lie in ruins. The priesthoods have been dissolved. The festivals have been abolished. Yet somehow, impossibly, the old powers continue to move through the Christian world that thought it had destroyed them. They wear new names, serve new masters, carry new meanings, but their essential forms persist, carved into the spiritual DNA of an empire that cannot completely escape its pagan past. Watch how the ancient magic survives through transformation rather than preservation, through adaptation rather than resistance. The gods do not return in their original forms. That door was sealed forever when the last temples burned. Instead, they seep through the cracks in Christian theology, emerge in the corners of Christian art, whisper through the rhythms of Christian ritual like ghosts who refuse to be exorcised. Sol's golden radiance becomes the halo that marks divine presence in Christian iconography. Every saint's portrait carries the sun god's crown. Every depiction of Christ blazes with solar fire. Every angel burns with light that once belonged to Apollo's chariot as it raced across the ancient sky. The artists who paint these halos believe they are illustrating Christian doctrine about the light of the world, never suspecting that their brushes are guided by memories older than their faith. Diana retreats from her ruined temples to haunt the forests where Christian hermits seek solitude and divine encounter. She becomes the wilderness that tests saints, the untamed nature that threatens civilization, the wild feminine principle that must be conquered or transformed by masculine spiritual discipline. Yet she also becomes the forest saints who protect travelers, the virgin martyrs whose strength rivals her own, the holy women whose power over nature echoes her ancient authority. In the mountains of Gaul, St. Bridget tends sacred wells that once belonged to Celtic goddesses. Her miracles involve the same elemental forces that the Druids once commanded, water flowing from dry rocks, fire burning without fuel, cattle multiplying beyond natural possibility. Christian pilgrims who seek her intercession perform rituals that would be recognizable to their pagan ancestors. They circle her shrine 3 times. They leave offerings of bread and wine. They seek healing through contact with sacred springs. The goddess has not disappeared. She has been canonized, her divine power channeled through Christian categories that make her acceptable to Orthodox theology, while preserving her essential function as mediator between human need and natural abundance. Venus undergoes the most complex transformation of all, splitting into multiple Christian forms that reflect different aspects of her ancient nature. Her maternal love becomes the Virgin Mary, whose blue robes echo the sea foam from which the goddess once emerged. Her erotic power becomes Mary Magdalene, the reformed prostitute whose passionate devotion to Christ carries undertones of sacred sexuality that Christian theologians struggle to explain. Her role as patron of lovers becomes Saint Valentine, whose February martyrdom coincides suspiciously with the date when Romans once celebrated Lupercalia. But Venus's most profound survival comes through the architectural transformation of her greatest temple. The Pantheon in Rome, built by Hadrian to honor all gods, becomes Santa Maria ad Martires, dedicated to all Christian saints. The vast rotunda that once contained statues of Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and their divine companions now houses relics of Peter, Paul, Agnes, and their holy successors. The building's essential function remains unchanged. It is still a place where humans commune with supernatural powers, still a sacred space where earthly architecture opens onto heavenly reality, still a temple that connects mortal prayers to immortal responses. Only the names have changed, the faces have been altered, the theological explanations have been rewritten. The gods are gone, but their house remains, and in remaining it preserves something essential about their nature that Christian occupation cannot completely erase. Mercury's transformation proves the most subtle and perhaps the most successful. The messenger god who guided souls between worlds becomes the archangel Michael, who escorts the faithful dead to paradise and battles demons on heaven's battlefields. His caduceus becomes the sword of spiritual warfare. His winged sandals become the wings of angelic flight. His role as divine mediator becomes the intercessory function that makes angels necessary bridges between human prayer and divine response. Christian merchants who pray to Michael before beginning journeys unknowingly invoke the same divine protection that Roman traders once sought from Mercury. The god's function persists even as his identity transforms, his ancient power channeled through Christian theology that preserves his essential nature while denying his original name. Minerva's wisdom becomes Saint Catherine of Alexandria, the brilliant philosopher whose learning exceeded that of the pagan scholars who tried to confute her faith. Catherine's wheel, the spiked torture device that shattered when it touched her holy body, echoes the goddess's own symbol of the wheel of wisdom that turns eternal truths into temporal understanding. The saint's ability to defeat learned men in theological debate preserves Minerva's role as patron of intellectual achievement while redirecting that patronage from pagan philosophy to Christian apologetics. Janus, the two-faced god who ruled thresholds and transitions, disappears from obvious view but survives in the Christian emphasis on dual natures, divine and human in Christ, body and soul in humanity, earth and heaven in cosmic geography. Every Christian church becomes a Janus temple, marking the boundary between sacred and secular space. Every Christian ritual becomes a Janus ceremony, facilitating passage from one spiritual state to another. The most remarkable survival involves the gradual Christian adoption of practices that had once defined pagan religiosity. Relic veneration transforms the ancient custom of preserving sacred objects that carried divine power. Christian pilgrims who travel hundreds of miles to touch the bones of saints are performing journeys that would be instantly recognizable to pagans who once sought healing at the shrines of Asclepius or Apollo. The relics themselves function exactly like pagan cult objects, channeling supernatural power through physical contact with sacred matter. A fragment of the true cross performs the same theological work that a piece of Jupiter's altar had once accomplished. It makes divine presence available to human touch. It transforms ordinary matter into conduit for extraordinary grace. It proves that the spiritual world can penetrate the material world at specific geographical locations. Christian liturgy develops ceremonial complexity that rivals the most elaborate pagan rituals. The Mass becomes a theatrical performance that exceeds anything staged in ancient temples. Priests wearing golden vestments that sparkle like divine robes, altars decorated with precious stones that catch candlelight like captured stars, incense rising in clouds that carry prayers to heaven as surely as the smoke from pagan sacrifices once carried offerings to the gods. The Eucharist itself preserves the essential structure of sacrificial religion while transforming its meaning. Bread and wine become body and blood through priestly consecration, just as animal flesh once became divine food through ritual slaughter. Christians consume their God, just as pagans had once consumed their sacrificial offerings, achieving union with divine nature through the act of sacred eating. The calendar that had once pulsed with pagan festivals gradually fills with Christian celebrations that preserve the ancient rhythm of sacred time. Christmas replaces the winter solstice celebration of Sol Invictus, but maintains the same date, the same emphasis on light conquering darkness, the same promise of divine birth, bringing hope to a world trapped in winter's death. Easter absorbs the spring fertility festivals that had once honored Venus in Cybele and Attis, preserving their emphasis on death and resurrection, their promise that life triumphs over mortality, their celebration of natural cycles that mirror spiritual truths. The eggs and flowers that decorate Christian churches during Easter carry genetic traces of pagan symbols that once proclaimed the goddess's victory over winter's sterility. All Saints' Day transforms the Roman festival of Lemuria, when families had honored their ancestral dead with offerings of food and flowers. Christian families who visit graves on November 1st, leaving flowers and saying prayers for deceased relatives, are participating in rituals that would be instantly familiar to their pagan predecessors. The dead remain present in Christian cosmology just as they had in pagan belief, requiring ongoing relationship with the living, capable of interceding for those who remember them properly. Even the physical transformation of sacred space preserves more pagan elements than Christian authorities typically acknowledge. Pope Gregory's famous letter to Augustine of Canterbury explicitly instructs missionaries to convert temples rather than destroy them, to transform pagan festivals rather than eliminate them, to redirect religious energy rather than attempting to extinguish it entirely. This policy of spiritual recycling proves remarkably successful precisely because it recognizes that sacred space carries power that transcends the particular gods who happen to occupy it at any given moment. A temple site that has been consecrated by centuries of worship, prayer, and sacrifice cannot be easily secularized. It continues to generate spiritual energy that demands religious expression, whether that expression takes pagan or Christian forms. Churches built on temple foundations inherit something essential from their predecessors, an accumulated holiness that makes certain locations naturally conducive to divine encounter. Christians who pray in these converted spaces unknowingly benefit from spiritual infrastructure that pagans had spent generations constructing through repeated ritual practice. The catacombs beneath Rome reveal how thoroughly Christian art absorbs pagan visual vocabulary while transforming its meaning. Early Christian paintings show Christ as the Good Shepherd, a figure that would be instantly recognizable to worshippers of Hermes who had seen identical images of their god caring for sheep and guiding souls. Christian artists who painted these images believed they were illustrating gospel parables. never suspecting that their iconography preserved ancient theological concepts about divine care for human beings. Later, Christian art becomes even more sophisticated in its transformation of pagan elements. Medieval churches display green men, whose foliage faces echo Celtic nature spirits, gargoyles, whose demonic features preserve ancient beliefs about supernatural guardians, rose windows whose geometric patterns mirror the cosmic mandalas that had once adorned mystery religion temples. The artistic tradition that creates these hybrid forms operates through what might be called spiritual archaeology. Each generation of artists unconsciously excavates visual elements from earlier religious traditions, adapts them to contemporary theological needs, and passes them on to successors who continue the process of creative transformation. Christian mysticism develops along lines that would be entirely familiar to pagan Neoplatonists, who had sought direct experience of divine reality through philosophical contemplation and ritual practice. Mystics like Pseudo-Dionysius write about celestial hierarchies that mirror the cosmic order described in pagan texts, describe mystical union in language borrowed from mystery religions, prescribe spiritual disciplines that echo techniques developed in ancient philosophical schools. The monastery becomes Christianity's version of the philosophical academy, a place where seekers withdraw from ordinary society to pursue extraordinary spiritual goals through systematic training and communal support. Monastic life preserves the essential structure of ancient wisdom traditions while directing their methods toward Christian rather than pagan objectives. Even Christian theological language carries traces of concepts that originated in pagan thought. The doctrine of the Trinity adapts philosophical speculation about the relationship between transcendent unity and manifest multiplicity. The concept of incarnation transforms pagan beliefs about gods appearing in human form. The promise of resurrection develops pagan hopes for personal survival beyond bodily death. Christianity succeeds in displacing paganism, partly because it proves so effective at absorbing and transforming pagan elements, rather than simply rejecting them. The new faith does not offer a completely alternative approach to spiritual life, but rather a superior version of spiritual goods that paganism had already made attractive to potential converts. Where pagan mystery religions had promised individual salvation through secret initiation, Christianity offers universal salvation through public confession. Where pagan philosophy had taught union with divine reality through intellectual effort, Christianity provides union with God through faithful acceptance of revealed truth. Where pagan ritual had facilitated contact with supernatural powers through complex ceremonies, Christian sacraments accomplish the same contact through simpler means available to anyone willing to believe. The empire that emerges from Christianity's triumph over paganism bears the genetic traces of both traditions, like a child who resembles both parents while becoming something entirely new. Roman law continues to govern Christian society, but its application reflects Christian moral principles. Greek philosophy continues to shape Christian theology, but its conclusions must conform to scriptural revelation. Pagan artistic traditions continue to inspire Christian creativity, but their products must serve orthodox religious purposes. Modern visitors to Rome can still witness this complex inheritance in the cityscape itself. The Pantheon stands as perhaps the most perfect symbol of how pagan structures survive through Christian transformation. Its classical proportions unaltered, its sacred function unchanged, only its occupants replaced. The building proclaims both continuity and discontinuity, preservation and transformation, the death of the old gods and their resurrection in new forms. In St. Peter's Basilica, built over the circus where Christian martyrs had died for refusing to honor pagan gods, Egyptian obelisks frame the entrance like ancient sentinels who have switched allegiances but retained their posts. The stones that once marked sacred space for sun worship now mark sacred space for Christian worship, their meaning transformed, but their essential function preserved. Even the Sistine Chapel, that supreme achievement of Christian art, displays pagan elements that would have seemed scandalous to the first generations of Christian believers. Michelangelo's frescoes include Sibyl figures who had once prophesied for pagan gods, classical nude figures whose beauty was originally associated with pagan celebrations of physical perfection, architectural elements that deliberately echo the design principles of ancient temples. The chapel stands as testimony to how thoroughly Christianity had absorbed its classical inheritance by the Renaissance, creating art that simultaneously celebrates Christian themes and pagan aesthetics, honoring the God of Abraham while employing the visual vocabulary that Greeks and Romans had developed to represent their very different deities. Yet the survival of pagan elements within Christian culture creates ongoing tensions that periodically erupt into reform movements seeking to purify the faith from its classical contaminations. Iconoclastic controversies attempt to eliminate visual art that seems too reminiscent of idolatry. Puritan reforms try to strip Christian worship of ceremonial elements that echo pagan ritual practice. Pietistic revivals emphasize personal spiritual experience over institutional traditions that preserve too much ancient wisdom. These periodic purification efforts succeed in eliminating some pagan survivals, but never manage to achieve complete separation between Christian and classical elements. The cultural DNA that connects Christian Rome to pagan Rome proves too deeply embedded to be entirely extracted without destroying the civilization that carries it. In the end, the relationship between Christianity and paganism cannot be reduced to simple victory or defeat, preservation or destruction, continuity or discontinuity. What emerges from their encounter is something genuinely new, a Christian empire that is also genuinely Roman, a faith that preserves ancient wisdom while transforming it, a culture that honors both Jerusalem and Athens without becoming completely identified with either. The old gods do not return in their original forms, but they do not disappear entirely either. They survive as shadows and echoes, as artistic motifs and theological concepts, as ritual patterns and spiritual longings that no amount of orthodox teaching can completely eliminate from human religious experience. In churches across the former empire, candles flicker before saint statues whose faces carry traces of divine beauty that first appeared in pagan temples. Pilgrims circle holy shrines in patterns that echo ancient circumambulation rituals. Priests elevate consecrated bread and wine in gestures that preserve the essential structure of sacrificial offering. The gods may be dead, but their shadows walk eternal through the empire they once ruled, wearing Christian names, serving Christian purposes, but carrying in their transformed hearts something essential that connects the new world to the old. The cross to the temple, the Galilean to the immortal powers who taught humanity to reach beyond mortality toward whatever transcendent reality lies hidden behind the veil of ordinary existence. Rome did not simply become Christian. In a transformation more subtle and more profound than anyone at the time could have imagined, Christianity became Roman, inheriting not just an empire, but a spiritual legacy that would shape its development for millennia to come. The cross conquered, but in conquering it was conquered, transformed by the very tradition it had defeated into something that neither pure Christianity nor pure paganism could have become alone.